information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynn Thompson. The Broad Highway by Geoffrey Farnell. Section 24. Chapter 14. Concerning Black George's Letter. It was with a feeling of great relief that I watched the fellow out of sight. Nevertheless, his very presence seems to have left a blight upon all things, for he, viewing matters with the material eye of common sense, had thereby contaminated them. Even the air seemed less pure and sweet than it had been heretofore, so that, glancing over my shoulder, I was glad to see that Charmian had re-entered the cottage. "Here," said I to myself, "here is common sense in the shape of a half-witted peddling fellow, blundering into Arcadia, in the shape of a haunted cottage, a woman and a man. Straightway our peddler, being common sense, misjudges us, as indeed would every other common-sense individual the world over, for Arcadia, being of itself abstract and immaterial, is opposed to, and incapable of being understood by concrete common sense, and always will be. And there's the rub. And yet," said I, "thanks to the wanderer of the roads who built this cottage and hanged himself here, and thanks to a Highland Scot who performed wonderfully on the bagpipes, there is little chance of any common-sense vagrant venturing near Arcadia again, at least until the woman is gone, or the man is gone, or—" Here, going on to rub my chin, being somewhat at a loss, I found that I had been standing all this while, the broom in one hand and the belt in the other, and now, hearing a laugh behind me, I turned and saw Charmian was leaning in the open doorway, watching me. "And so you are the cove with the white hands and the taking ways, are you, Peter?" "Why, you were actually listening, then?" "Why, of course I was." "That," said I, "that was very undignified." "But very feminine, Peter." Hereupon I threw the belt from me one way and the broom the other, and sitting down upon the bench, began to fill my pipe rather awkwardly, being conscious of Charmian's mocking scrutiny. "Poor, poor Black George!" she sighed. "What do you mean by that?" said I quickly. "Really, I can almost understand his being angry with you." "Why?" "You walked with her and talked with her, Peter, like Caesar. You came, you saw, you conquered." Here I dragged my tinder box from my pocket so awkwardly as to bring the lining with it. "And even smiled at her, Peter, and you so rarely smile." Having struck flint and steel several times without success, I thrust the tinder box back into my pocket and fixed my gaze upon the moon. "Is she so very pretty, Peter?" I stared up at the moon without answering. "I wonder if you bother her with your Epictetus and Dryasdust quotations?" I bit my lips and stared up at the moon. "Or perhaps she likes your musty books and philosophy?" But presently, finding that I would not speak, Charmian began to sing, very sweet and low, as if to herself, yet, when I chanced to glance towards her, I found her mocking eyes still watching me. Now the words of her song were these: "Oh, my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love's like the melody that's sweetly played in tune." And so, at last, unable to bear it any longer, I rose and, taking my candle, went into my room and closed the door. But I had been there scarcely 5 minutes when Charmian knocked. "Oh, Peter, I wish to speak to you, please." Obediently I opened the door. "What is it, Charmian?" "You dropped this from your pocket when you took out your tinder box so clumsily," said she, holding towards me a crumpled paper. And looking down at it, I saw that it was Black George's letter to Prudence. Now, as I took it from her, I noticed that her hand trembled, while in her eyes I read fear and trouble. And seeing this, I was, for a moment, unwontedly glad, and then wondered at myself. "You did not read it, of course?" said I, well knowing that she had. "Yes, Peter, it lay open, and—" "Then," said I, speaking my thought aloud, "you know that she loves George." "He means you no harm," said she, speaking with her head averted, "and if he killed you—" "I should be spared a deal of sorrow, and mortification, and—other people would be no longer bothered by Epictetus and dry-as-dust quotations." She turned suddenly, and, crossing to the open doorway, stood leaning there. "But indeed," I went on hurriedly, "there is no chance of such a thing happening, not the remotest. Black George's bark is 1,000 times worse than his bite. This letter means nothing, nothing at all," I ended, somewhat lamely, for she had turned and was looking at me over her shoulder. "If he has to wait and wait, and follow you and follow you," said she in the same low tone. "Those are merely the words of a half-mad pedlar," said I. "And your blood will go soaking and soaking into the grass." "Our pedlar has a vivid imagination," said I, lightly, but she shook her head, and turned to look out upon the beauty of the night once more, while I watched her, chin in hand. "I was angry with you to night, Peter," said she at length, "because you ordered me to do something against my will, and I did it, and so I tried to torment you. You will forgive me for that, won't you?" "There is nothing to forgive, nothing, and—good night, Charmian." Here she turned, and, coming to me, gave me her hand. "Charmian Brown will always think of you as a—" "Blacksmith," said I. "As a blacksmith," she repeated, looking at me with a gleam in her eyes, "but oftener as a—" "Pedant," said I. "As a pedant," she repeated obediently, "but most of all as a—" "Well?" said I. "As a—man," she ended, speaking with bent head. And here again I was possessed of a sudden gladness that was out of all reason, as I immediately told myself. "Your hand is very small," said I, finding nothing better to say. "Smaller even than I thought." "Is it?" And she smiled and glanced up at me beneath her lashes, for her head was still bent. "And wonderfully smooth and soft." "Is it?" said she again, but this time she did not look up at me. Now another man might have stooped and kissed those slender, shapely fingers, but as for me, I loosed them rather suddenly, and once more bidding her good night, re-entered my own chamber and closed the door. But to night, lying upon my bed, I could not sleep, and fell to watching the luminous patch of sky framed in my open casement. I thought of Charmian, of her beauty, of her strange whims and fancies, her swift changing moods and her contrariness, comparing her, in turn, to all those fair women I had ever read of or dreamed over in my books. Little by little, however, my thoughts drifted to Gabbing Dick and Black George, and with my mind's eye I could see him as he was, perhaps at this very moment, fierce-eyed and grim of mouth, sitting beneath some hedgerow, while, knife in hand, he trimmed and trimmed his 2 bludgeons, one of which was to batter the life out of me. From such disquieting reflections I would turn my mind to sweet–eyed Prudence, to the Ancient, the Forge, and the 1,001 duties of the morrow. I bethought me once more of the storm, of the coming of Charmian, of the fierce struggle in the dark, of the postilion, and of Charmian again. And yet, in spite of me, my thoughts would revert to George, and I would see myself even as the pedlar pictured me, out in some secluded corner of the woods, lying stiffly upon my back, with glassy eyes staring up sightlessly through the whispering leaves above, while my blood soaked and soaked into the green, and with a blackbird singing gloriously upon my motionless breast. Chapter 15. Which being in parenthesis may be skipped if the reader so desire. As this life is a broad highway along which we must all of us pass whether we will or no, as it is a thoroughfare sometimes very hard and cruel in the going, and beset by many hardships, sometimes desolate and hatefully monotonous, so also must its aspect sooner or later change for the better, and the stony track overpassed, the choking heat and dust left behind, we may reach some green refreshing haven shady with trees, and full of the cool sweet sound of running waters. Then who shall blame us if we pause unduly in this grateful shade, and, lying upon our backs awhile, gaze up through the swaying green of trees to the infinite blue beyond, ere we journey on once more, as soon we must, to front whatsoever of good or evil lies waiting for us in the hazy distance? To just such a place I am now come, in this my history, the record of a period which I afterwards remembered as the happiest I had ever known, the memory of which must remain with me, green and fragrant everlastingly. If in the forthcoming pages you shall find overmuch of Charmian, I would say, in the first place, that it is by her and upon her that this narrative hangs, and in the second place, that in this part of my story I find my greatest pleasure; though here, indeed, I am faced with a great difficulty, seeing that I must depict, as faithfully as may be, that most difficult, that most elusive of all created things, to wit, a woman. Truly I begin to fear lest my pen fail me altogether, for the very reason that it is of Charmian that I would tell, and of Charmian I understand little more than nothing. For what rule has ever been devised whereby a woman's mind may be accurately gauged, and who of all those wise ones who have written hitherto, poets, romancers, or historians, has ever fathomed the why and wherefore of the mind feminine? A fool indeed were I to attempt a thing impossible. But I do seek to show her to you as I saw her, and to describe her in so far as I learned to know her. And yet, how may I begin? I might tell you that her nose was neither arched nor straight, but perfect none the less. I might tell you of her brows, straight and low, of her eyes, long and heavy lashed, of her chin, firm and round and dimpled. And yet that would not be Charmian, for I could not paint you the scarlet witchery of her mouth with the sudden bewildering changes, nor show you how sweetly the lower lip curved up to meet its mate. I might tell you that to look into her eyes was like gazing down into very deep water, but I could never give you their varying beauty, nor the way she had with her lashes, nor can I ever describe her rich, warm colouring, nor the lithe grace of her body. Thus it is that I misdoubt my pen of its task, and fear that, when you shall have read these pages, you shall at best have caught but a very imperfect reflection of Charmian as she really is. Wherefore I will waste no more time or paper upon so unprofitable a task, but hurry on with my narrative, leaving you to find her out as best you may. Section 24.